Before you start your journey down the path to becoming a JS user, it's important that we cover a few fundamental concepts of space. As a JS deals with spatial information often, an understanding of how space is represented and measured will provide an important foundation for you to build up on. There are three fundamental concepts of spatial analysis: space, location, and distance. We will cover each one of those concepts in detail. Begin with a space. Space can be measured in absolute, relative, and cognitive terms. Absolute space can be thought of as mathematical space. Absolute space involves the precise measurements of location and space, such as an XYZ coordinate. Absolute space should provide an unambiguous description of space. For example, all the information coded on the topographic map shown here is stored and displayed as a representation of absolute location in space. All locations and features are all described using precise measurement and calculations. Topological space can be thought of as relative space. Relative space deals with the definition of one location based on the location of another object. Those topology relationships represent connected between features of the world. In topological space, precise measurement of a space is not as important as relative descriptions of space features. For example, this is a map of Washington, D.C. Metro Rail. This map shows all the routes that the Metro Rail takes. Notice that each stop is evenly spaced on this map. Do you think that each stop is truly even spaced in the real world? No, of course not. As a writer of the Metro Rail, are you concerned with how far apart the stops are, or the number of stops before you exit the metro? In the situation of being a passenger on the Metro Rail, topologic space is much more important than absolute space, as your only concerns was getting from point A to point B. Is how many times do the doors open before you get off, not how many miles you travel before you exit the metro. The third type of space is cognitive space. Cognitive space reflects people's belief, experience, and perceptions about place. For example, this is a drawing of a university campus from a student's memory. A freshman student may know the location of dorms, the student union, and the dining hall very well, but not know the rest of campus at all. Conversely, a senior who lives off campus may know of the locations of every parking lot very well, the locations of many classrooms, locations of the student union, but not be familiar with the locations of the dorms. Now we will discuss the fundamental concept of locations. Locations can be described in four ways: absolute, relative, cognitive, and nominal. Let's start with absolute location. Absolute location is considered an unambiguous descriptor of the location, typically expressed as a coordinate such as latitude and longitude. And absolute locations cannot be confused with any other locations on Earth. Next is relative location. Relative locations is expressed as both the concept of the set and a situation. Let's discuss what that means. Set refers to the physical attributes of the location, for example, the terrain, soil, vegetation, water source, beauty environment, and so on. The situations refer to the locations of a place relative to other places and human activities. Now we move on the cognitive location. Cognitive location refers to the personal cognitive imagings of the places and regions compiled from personal knowledge, experiences, and impressions. For instance, Walker's Springs was considered an important fishing ground and source of food for the native inhabitants. Now, the same source of water is seen as a reclusion area. So, while this is the same physical location, it's perceived differently based on how it is experienced. The last way in which we thinking of location is nominal location. A nominal location is a location that you remember being at when you heard about an event that took place at a different location. For instance, many people remember where they were when they heard the news of the 911 attacks. Even though they may not have been near the attacks, the personal memory of the attacks is linked to the position the locations the person was at when they heard the news. Therefore, the locations where they heard the news is the nominal location that is linked to the distance locations where the events took place. It's important to know that the systems of measuring, representing location of the instant, absolute, relative, nominal are cultural systems which are embedded in different cultures and the worldviews and become inscribed in landscape. Each culture will have influence on the way in which space is described and perceived. The third fundamental concept of spatial analysis is distance. Distance is described in absolute, relative, and cognitive terms. Absolute distance is a physical unit of measure. For instance, number of miles between downtown Houston and downtown Toronto. A relative distance is calculated measuring distance using metrics such as time, effort, or cost. For instance, the distance of two cities may be 2,000 miles apart, which is an absolute description of distance. Becomes the distance of two cities measuring tanks of gas or mileage charge is described in relative descriptions. Last, let's discuss the cognitive perceptions of distance. This refers to an individual perceptions of how far things are apart. For example, to some, driving 200 miles between Houston and San Antonio, Texas is a reasonable driving. However, for others, a 200 miles drive may seem like a very, very far distance to travel if they are not used to traveling such a distance regularly. Lastly, you should be familiar with the first law of geography. Waldo Tabler, Professor Emeritus at University of California, Santa Barbara, Department of Geographic State. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related to each other. This is widely considered the first law of geography and speaks to the idea that space and relative and cognitive relationships featured in the space have an influence on the development and the interactions of those features.